Welcome back to How Bach Chorales Work. Part 4 is about chords, but before we look at the normal progressions such as 2, 5, 1, it's useful to think about the intervals that make up the different chords, such as major, minor, and the other chords. Especially, you guessed it, whether they include perfect consonances and dissonant intervals, because those intervals will restrict what can happen next, irrespective of what the roots are, tonic, dominant, etc. So I'll start with triads, first the consonant ones, then the dissonant ones, and then look at seventh chords, which are always dissonant. And along the way, I'll explain the slightly confusing alternative chords that you get in minor keys. Triads are chords with 3 different chord factors called the root, third, and fifth, which can be stacked in thirds like this. This is a C major triad. The term chord factor is very useful because the chord terminology can be somewhat confusing because of the same ordinal numbers, third, fifth, and seventh, being used to refer to these elements of the chord, but also to the intervals between them. And in root position, the third is the note that's a third or a compound third above the bass note, which is the root. And the fifth is the note that's a fifth or a compound fifth above the bass note, which is the root. But inversions are not like that. In first inversion, the lowest note is called the third, and the note a third above that is the fifth, because that's in relation to an imagined root at the bottom. Likewise, the bass note of a second inversion chord is the chordal fifth, and the note a fourth above that is the root. So the chordal third is now a sixth above the bass note. You'll find major triads, minor, diminished, and occasionally augmented. Incidentally, if you ever see anything that looks like a triad but has a diminished third, you're probably looking at an augmented sixth chord, possibly in an inversion, in which case it's usually misleading to identify a root. But in any case, these are very uncommon in chorales, so we won't go into that at all. Occasionally, Bach will omit the fifth entirely and maybe double the root and third, perhaps C, E, for example. So he's only using 2 pitch classes, so we would call this an incomplete chord, and there'll be an implied note that you don't hear, but that you imagine. Before analysing the interval content of different triads, let me explain the extra chords you get in the minor mode. In major keys, you get 7 diatonic triads, 1 for each scale degree. Major, minor, minor, major, major, minor, and diminished. Capital means major, lowercase means minor, lowercase with a degree sign means diminished. In the minor, you get more than 7 diatonic chords depending on whether the ascending melodic minor scale notes are used, and this frequently causes some confusion. You can see that the supertonic chord can be diminished or minor. The subdominant chord can be minor or major. It appears that you can have a major or a minor dominant chord, and then you can have a major chord on the flat 7th degree of the scale and a diminished chord on the raised 7th degree of the scale. So let's explain these. The extra chords mainly exist for melodic reasons, and above all, they're to allow you to avoid moving by an augmented second step. For example, in C minor, from A flat to B natural. Thus, the supertonic chord, which is ordinarily diminished and will usually be in first inversion, has a fifth which is an A flat, and this will tend to resolve down by step most often. Because otherwise, if it went up to a B natural, you'd get an augmented second step. And if you want the fifth of that chord, which is the submediant degree, to go up to the leading note, then you raise it as per the melodic minor scale. And that means that the supertonic chord will now be a minor chord, D minor. And if you use this D minor chord, you create the expectation that A will go up to B, and if it doesn't go up to B, the chord will sound wrong. The subdominant chord is normally minor, and again the third, the note A flat, will normally resolve down, or sometimes skip down, or perhaps skip up to the tonic, but it won't step up to the leading note. If you want that note to step up to the leading note, then you raise the sixth degree of the scale, and therefore your subdominant chord becomes major. And again, if you don't ascend from A to B, then the major chord will sound wrong because it's not obvious why it would be there. Next, the dominant chord. This should be major whenever it has a dominant function, which is that of making you expect the tonic chord again. So don't forget to raise the seventh degree of the scale, otherwise it won't be a genuine leading note. Sometimes you will get a minor chord on the dominant note. Most often, this chord would not be functioning as a dominant chord at all, but it could be a descending passing chord, or it could be in a sequence. So let's put it in brackets for now, and I'll come back to those things. The leading note chord is always a diminished triad on the note a semitone below the tonic. This chord will always be in first inversion, and it normally resolves to the tonic, but it could also be what we call a passing chord, like this. And I'm about to come back to this. But in a minor key, that normally wouldn't happen because it would involve an augmented second down to A flat. So in a minor key, you should always raise the leading note if you want it to resolve up to the tonic. And if you want the seventh degree of the scale to go down by step, you use this chord here, which is often labeled flat 7. But I would either call it a passing chord, or quite often it's used as the dominant of E flat. So quite often when you get this chord, you're modulating into the relative major. And in fact, when you see so-called chord 3, more often than not, you'll have momentarily modulated into the relative major, and then you're going to modulate quite often back again. But watch out for the leading note chord. If it's not a semitone below the tonic, it's not going to be perceived as a proper leading note. Now, all these chords have contrapuntal implications. What does that mean? Here is the 1-minute summary regarding triads. Major and minor chords include a perfect fifth or compound perfect fifth whenever they are in root position, and sometimes when they're inverted. So the contrapuntal implication is that we have to check how every fifth is approached and avoid parallel fifths. Major and minor chords in second inversion, and diminished and augmented chords at any time, include at least one dissonant interval, which will have to be resolved. And in 4-part harmony, we will have to double one of the chord factors of any triad. That is, the same chord factor will appear in 2 voices at the same time. So regardless of which chord and which chord factor you double, there will inevitably be an octave or a unison, or a double octave like this, or a triple octave, every time you use a triad. Thus it will be necessary to avoid parallel octaves and unisons, or even anti-parallel or contrary ones, whenever you use a triadic chord. And this is why it's next to impossible to do a chorale if you believe that you must never double the third, or that you're never allowed any similar motion to an octave or a unison. That was the quick version. Now I'll go into some more details, starting with the chords that are completely consonant. The 100% consonant triads are root position major and minor chords, and first inversion major and minor chords. Root position chords are also called 5/3 chords, as in Baroque figured bass notation, which keyboard players, lute players, and so on would use if they had to fill in harmony from a bass line. These are 5/3 chords because the intervals from the lowest note up are a fifth and a third. It's still called a 5/3 chord even if you shift the fifth and or third up in register by 1 octave or more, and even if you double the notes above the bass. It's still classified as a 5/3 chord. It's all about which intervals occur from the lowest note up. First-inversion chords are also known as 6/3 chords. Here's a major one, here's a minor one, because the intervals above the bass note are a sixth and a third. Now these chords are 100% consonant because all the component intervals are consonant from the bass up and from the middle up. So a major triad root position consists of a major third and a perfect fifth, and the remainder interval, if you like, is a minor third. Root position minor chord, you've got a minor third and a perfect fifth, and from the middle up, from the third up, you've got a major third, then you've got minor third, minor sixth, perfect fourth, major third, major sixth, perfect fourth. And remember that perfect fourths that are not from the bass up are treated as imperfect consonances. And the respective character of these chords are a bit like those of the perfect and imperfect consonances, because 5/3 chords are very stable and tend to sound relatively conclusive. 6/3 chords, even though they're consonant, sound mobile or active. You know they have to proceed to another chord. They're going somewhere more than the 5/3 chords. So these chords often connect two of these chords. They're often passing chords, as we'll see later. And this is a big difference that you should bear in mind whenever you use these chords. As I suggested previously, you can never use root position chords in parallel because of the parallel fifths that you get. And that's before you even double a note. So you should never see anything like this in your chorale. It wouldn't look exactly like this because one note would be in the other clef, but the point is, never do this. You can use two root position chords in a row, like this, as long as you voice the chords differently so the fifths are not between the same two voices. Whereas, you can use parallel 6/3 chords, ascending or descending, like this, with a root at the top, without changing the spacing, because parallel perfect fourths that are not from the bass up are fine. They can be in parallel. And you can even throw in a diminished triad like this one. You can do the same thing in the minor key. And this pattern is one of the circumstances in which you might use so-called chord flat 7. Here it's the first of two passing chords connecting up a tonic and dominant chord in C minor. In Bach chorales, you don't normally get long chains of parallel 6/3 chords, but in itself the progression is okay. But in 4 parts, it's more complicated because you have to add a fourth voice, and you can't just double one of these parts in octaves or unisons because of the parallel octaves that you would immediately get. Or unisons. So the usual solution, if you must use 4 parts, which is the case in a chorale but wouldn't be the case in lots of other genres, would be for the extra part, which would normally be an inner part, to keep varying which chord factor it doubles. For example, the tenor can go here C, E, A, and the tenor doubles first the alto, then the soprano note, and then the alto note again, thus eliminating the parallel octaves, but it's still 6/3 chords, which are also labelled with just a 6 in figured bass. Problem solved, but this trick won't work with parallel 5/3 chords. What about first inversion chords with the fifth at the top. Root fifth, root fifth. Here the root was at the top. But if the fifth is above the root, you're going to get parallel fifths. But in principle, there's a way of mitigating these fifths, which is to use suspensions. And then you would see 6 for the 6-3 chord, followed by 7-6, meaning there's a 7-6 suspension in the alto. And you would again have to do a zigzag in the extra part. Perhaps you would, depending on what occurred before, you might have to do a unison here and then double the fifth. I'm moving on now from the completely consonant chords to a chord that is treated as almost completely consonant and was already treated as more or less consonant in Renaissance music. And that's the first inversion diminished triad, such as B diminished, root, third, fifth. The point with this chord is that strictly it's dissonant because it includes a tritone or a diminished fifth between the top notes. But because both of the intervals from the bass up are consonant, it's treated as more or less consonant and roughly like other 6-3 chords. But the main rule is that the dissonant interval at the top should resolve, and it can resolve in a number of ways, but what they have in common is that one or normally both notes will resolve by a step, specifically by a tone or a semitone, and not an augmented second. So this determines what can come next. First, let's say the root is at the top of the chord. Here we have to think in terms of the scale. In a major scale, this chord, if it's a diatonic chord, is going to be the leading note chord, the chord whose root is the leading note. And it will always be in first inversion, and will never double the root, because the root's the leading note. Now, if the root is at the top, we've got an augmented fourth interval in the chord. And generally, augmented intervals want to expand and get bigger. So the default resolution for this chord would normally be for the leading note to resolve up and the subdominant note, F in this case, to resolve down. And then the other note would also normally resolve down or possibly move to a submediant note. But the important thing is that we're looking at how this interval resolves at the top. But both notes could resolve up together with the other note, as in the parallel 6-3 progression that we just looked at. Or it could be that this chord is a descending passing chord, in which case both notes descend because they're both passing notes, but it's still the case that they resolve by step. And then if we're in 4 parts, we'll have to double a note, not the leading note. So if we double the chordal fifth, which is F, then one will go up like this, and one will go down like this. And if we double the chordal third, then again one will go up and the other will go down, perhaps like this. The same chord is the leading note chord in C minor, and it will resolve the same way. But this will be E flat. This will be E flat. And this time, if you use a descending passing chord, you won't use a B natural, you'll have a B flat. But if this is a dominant chord, you'll make the B natural again down here. This B is flat because it's a passing note to connect up the tonic and the dominant. This note is B natural because it's really the leading note. But as we know, in the minor key, the supertonic triad is also usually a diminished triad. So if I'm in C minor, chord 2 would be D diminished usually, unless I make A natural. And again, the augmented interval will tend to expand, especially because A flat wants to normally descend. And the root might move up in a way that resembles the leading note chord. But more often this chord progresses to a dominant chord anyway, so the root is likely to stay the same. And then there'd be a B natural as well in this chord. Or it could even skip down to the leading note like this. Now let's imagine that the fifth is at the top of the chord, and the root's in the middle. The default resolution of a diminished interval will be to contract inwards like this. But curiously, you can also still resolve both notes up, even though doing so gives you unequal fifths, which I mentioned previously. These are called unequal fifths because this is a diminished fifth and this is a perfect fifth. And because they're not both perfect, they're not perceived as genuinely parallel. So this progression is okay, provided it's above a bass line that also steps up in parallel tenths, parallel compound thirds with the soprano. But you can only do this between a diminished and a perfect triad, not between two perfect triads. Now I'm moving on to triads that are outright dissonant chords, starting with major and minor chords in second inversion, which we also call 6/4 chords because the intervals above the bass note are a sixth and a fourth. And these are definitely dissonant because you remember that fourths from the lowest note, the bass note up, are dissonant. And I'm going to go into a bit more detail about this chord because it's often used wrongly. And by bass here, I just mean the lowest note at any given moment. So even if three flutes play this, the lowest note is still the bass note. And the key thing, as I discussed previously, is that you have to be able to identify which note is the dissonant one and explain what kind of dissonant note it is, such as a passing note, suspension, etc. Let's go through the most common circumstances in which you would get a 6/4 chord. First is the cadential 6/4, which might look like this. On a strong beat, you get a 6/4 chord, which I think at A level or for ABRSM is normally labeled as a 1C, which resolves to a chord 5, dominant chord, dominant leading note supertonic, and then to chord 1 again, tonic chord. Here, in this case, the dissonant note is the apparent root C. The fourth is from G up to C, and we can say that the C is the dissonant note because it's the one that resolves to the leading note. And then the leading note goes back up because it's the leading note. But what kind of dissonant note is the note C, I hear you ask? Well, it depends what comes before it. If the C is already there, then this C is a suspension, because it's prepared and then it resolves. But if the previous note was the note D, then the C can be called a passing note, an accented passing note. And those are the two most common options, the two most normal ways of preparing a cadential 6/4. And this is why academic analysts don't generally call this 1C, because the supposed root is just a suspension or a passing note. So we would put 5, 6, 4, 5, 3, like this. But you should call this chord whatever your syllabus calls it. You can get this pattern in the middle of a phrase too, in which case it would be called an accented 6/4, not a cadential 6/4, but it would be the same pattern. Another fairly common circumstance in which you would get a 6/4 chord would be this. This time the 6/4 chord, C major chord in second inversion, is a passing 6/4. It's the lower note, not the C at the top, but the G, which is behaving as the dissonant note, and it's the one that resolves, and it's a passing note between the submediant and the subdominant note. And the most common idiom is for this C to then in turn become a suspension, and it's in fact the seventh of a seventh chord, which we'll come back to. But this is a subdominant chord in first inversion, and 6 conveniently looks like a B, and then passing 6/4 chord followed by a supertonic 7th chord, which is a 6/5, come back to that, and then a dominant chord, and then you get your tonic chord. The other voice will fit in. And this is how our chorale Du Frieden Fürst, Herr Jesu Christ from before ends, except it's in A major. Another fairly common pattern in major-minor system is this. You get a dominant chord, a tonic chord, which is second inversion, and then another dominant chord. And there are two reasonable explanations. One is that the C is an upper neighbor note, so it's sometimes called a neighboring 6/4. The other explanation is that the bass note is a pedal. That means that the bass note temporarily becomes dissonant and then consonant again. So that would make this a pedal 6/4, because a dissonant pedal note is just a sustained or repeated note, usually in the bass, unless it's an inverted pedal, that becomes dissonant but is tolerated anyway because it's sustained. And quite often, the second root position chord will be decorated with a suspension like this. And this would be called a double cadence, but it's a dominant chord, and then there's a 1, and then there's a 4/3 suspension. The other dissonant triads are root position and second inversion diminished triads, and augmented chords in any inversion. 5/3 meaning root position, 6/3 meaning first inversion, and 6/4 meaning second inversion. And the root position diminished triad is more dissonant than the first inversion one because it includes a dissonance from the bass up, which is a diminished fifth. Or, in second inversion, an augmented fourth. But these chords are perfectly good chords. If you see them in classical music or Baroque music, you should interpret them as incomplete dominant 7th chords with an implied root that isn't actually played or sung. But in 4-part harmony, inversions of dominant 7th chords should be complete, which would mean that the G would be included, and therefore, even though these chords are good, they don't belong in a chorale, so we can forget about them. That leaves the augmented triads, which are pretty unusual in chorales. This is the chord that would haunt you in your mind if you were Jimmy Stewart and you had vertigo, or if you were Faust, but they're not frequent in chorales, so we can forget them as well. On the rare occasions that you spot one, they will resolve normally like this. The chromatically raised 5th of the chord will resolve up by step, and a few different chords might be possible, but that note will be found as part of a consonant chord normally. And that finishes the triads. We can now move on to 7th chords. Now it's time to explore the wonderful world of seventh chords. Chords with 4 chord factors: a root, third, fifth, and a seventh. Here, for example, is a root position D minor seventh chord in close position, meaning with the chord factors as close together as possible. Here's another root position D minor seventh chord as it might appear in a chorale, with a big gap between the bass and the tenor. And here is another voicing of the same D minor 7 chord. As in triads, the upper notes can be arranged vertically in any order. The classification of the chord as root position depends only on the bass note. And the main considerations to do with seventh chords are, first, they include 4 different chord factors instead of 3, and 2, they're dissonant, and specifically the chordal seventh, wherever it is in the texture, almost always resolves down by step, either into the next chord or sometimes in between chords. And the fact that these chords include 4 different pitches means, first of all, that, unlike triads, these chords have one different note for each voice of a 4-part choir. And this is convenient because you never have to double any note, and therefore you can avoid having to think about parallel octaves and unisons, although you still have to think about parallel fifths. So that's good news. In fact, to double a note, you would need to leave another one out, and the general rule is that this would only be done in root position seventh chords, as long as the root isn't the leading note. And in a root position seventh chord, sometimes you can double the root and omit the fifth, which in this case is the note A. Clearly, if you omitted the seventh, then the chord would no longer be perceived as a seventh chord. But inversions of seventh chords should be complete. That is, you should use all 4 chord factors. And there are 3 inversions instead of 2. Root position, first inversion, second inversion, third inversion. And in figured bass notation, the root position 7th chord would be marked with a 7, which is short for 7-5-3, because there's a 7th above the bass, a 5th above the bass, and a 3rd above the bass. And even if you spread them out differently, there's still a 7th, a 5th, and a 3rd above the bass. The first inversion, which is the most common, is called a 6-5 chord, because there's a 6th above the bass and a 5th above the bass. And that's short for 6-5-3. Second inversion is known as a 4-3 chord, which is short for 6-4-3, because there's a 6th, 4th, and 3rd above the bass. And third inversion is called either a 4-2 or just a 2 chord, which is short for 6-4-2, because there's a 6th above the bass, a 4th, and a 2nd above the bass. As I said, the other important aspect of seventh chords is that they're dissonant, and they include at least one dissonant interval, which is from the root to the 7th. In a root position chord, that interval is always a 7th. In first and second inversion chords, the interval between the root and the 7th might be a 7th. For example, if we voice the chord like so, root up to the 7th, 3rd, 5th. Or it could be a 2nd, which is the inversion of a 7th. And in third inversion chords, there will always be an interval of a 2nd or a 9th, because the 7th is the lowest note. And in fact, I find this inversion particularly effective because the resolution of the 7th in the bass is quite powerful. But as I said, in almost all cases, the chordal 7th, which is what makes the chord a 7th chord, will resolve down by step in the same voice, so from C to a B. There's one idiom in which it can go up in unequal fifths, but I'll discuss that in a moment. As a rule, it resolves down by step, so it should never be wrong to do that, to make the seventh resolve down by step. And this will determine what the next chord can be. And like the leading note, but even more strictly, the seventh will never be doubled because it's expected to resolve in a particular way, even more strongly than this leading note. So if you doubled it, you would either have parallels or a note that didn't resolve properly. And in any case, it's a dissonant note, and you don't normally double dissonant notes. Let's briefly go through all the possible diatonic seventh chords. If you construct a diatonic seventh chord on every note of the major scale, you get a major seventh chord, which is a major triad plus a major seventh, a minor seventh chord, which is a minor triad with a minor seventh, another minor seventh chord, another major seventh chord, a dominant seventh chord, which is a major triad plus a minor seventh, another minor seventh chord, and a half diminished seventh chord, which is a diminished triad plus a minor seventh. And if you do the same thing for the minor scale, you get a minor seventh chord, a half diminished seventh chord, a minor seventh chord, a major seventh chord, quite an unusual one, a minor seventh, a dominant seventh on the subdominant note, a minor seventh chord, a dominant seventh, a major seventh, a dominant seventh, the dominant of the relative major, and a diminished seventh. Finally, diminished seventh chord is a diminished triad plus a diminished seventh. However, you shouldn't indiscriminately use all of these seventh chords. Most of them would only be used in special circumstances, either in sequences, which are not extensively used in chorales, or maybe as the result of suspensions. For example, Bach will quite frequently use subdominant seventh chords, and the seventh will be a suspension. But I'm going to focus on the most regularly used seventh chords, and most important ones, which are the dominant seventh, so called because it's the seventh chord you get when the root is on the dominant scale degree, in the major and also in the minor if you correctly raise the leading note, and the supertonic seventh chord, which is the seventh chord you get when the root is the supertonic note. And in the major key, the supertonic seventh will be a minor seventh chord, unless something odd happens. And in the minor key, it could be a minor seventh, or more often a half diminished chord with an A flat, for reasons I already explained. The distinctive feature of the dominant seventh chord is that it also includes a tritone from the third to the seventh. The third of the chord is the leading note, and the seventh of the chord is the subdominant note of the scale. And in fact, in two-part counterpoint, you would quite often get this diminished fifth, or if it's inverted, augmented fourth, and from that you would be able to hear that these two notes represent, in most cases, a dominant seventh chord. And this interval normally resolves in contrary motion. The seventh of the chord resolves down, because it's a seventh. And the third of the chord, which is the leading note, typically resolves up because it's the leading note. And the leading note is an active scale degree. So they resolve for different reasons, and reasons that are slightly easy to confuse because the seventh of the chord involves the same number as the seventh degree of the scale. But anyway, this interval will normally contract inwards if it's a diminished fifth, and if it's voiced as a augmented fourth, then it will still be the same resolutions, but this time in expanding motion like this. And this means that the chord following a dominant seventh chord, unless you throw in a surprise of some kind, will be a chord that includes the tonic and mediant notes. So that means that this will either be a tonic chord, as in an authentic cadence, but not only a cadence, or a submediant chord with an A. as in an interrupted cadence, but not only as in a cadence. And there's again an exception to this, which is that a second inversion dominant seventh chord can resolve like this. Just like a leading note chord, but with the addition of the notes G and G. That is to say, with unequal fifths, a diminished fifth and a perfect fifth. And this is provided that the bass moves up in parallel tenths with the soprano. The special feature of the supertonic seventh chord is that the chordal seventh is the tonic note. So whenever this chord is used, the tonic note will normally resolve down to the leading note, which is going to tend to resolve back up in most cases. And this is the opposite of the usual situation, which is that the leading note is attracted to the tonic note. This means that the chord after a supertonic seventh chord will include the leading note, and that would normally be true of a supertonic chord with no seventh, but especially if there's a seventh, there will be a leading note in the next chord, or at least there'll be a leading note straight after this chord. So again, unless you deliberately throw in a surprise, which Bach quite often does, and the surprise would still include the leading note, the supertonic seventh chord is most likely to progress to a dominant chord, or possibly a dominant seventh chord in some cases, which is a primary chord, so it's the most likely chord. And in fact, the supertonic seventh chord is what we call a predominant chord, which means that you expect it to go to the dominant because pre means before the dominant. The supertonic seventh in the major key is less dissonant because it's a minor seventh chord, less dissonant than the dominant seventh because it has no tritone in it. If you're in the minor key, then you're using the half diminished, sometimes with this symbol, and this means that there's a tritone from the root up to the fifth, or diminished fifth in this case. So this chord has a special flavor that makes it sound somewhat romantic if you play it on its own, out of context especially. And as I mentioned, this note here, the A flat, will tend to resolve down, just because of the diminished fifth. Now I mentioned how the seventh of a seventh chord resolves, but let's also consider how it's prepared, or what happens before it. Sometimes a descending passing note gives you a seventh chord as a byproduct. For example here, if I throw in a passing note in the bass between my dominant chord and my tonic chord first inversion, I momentarily get a third inversion dominant seventh chord. In this case, the seventh F can't be thrown in as a passing note, but what sometimes happens is that you skip up to the seventh, like so, in such a way that it can still resolve. But if the seventh is part of the chord from the outset and not an extra decorative note, it normally behaves either like an accented descending passing note or a suspension. Here we have tonic, first inversion, dominant, first inversion, tonic. And this is a dominant seventh because there's an F. And the F acts a little bit like a passing note. Here's another normal progression. Tonic, supertonic, seventh in first inversion, dominant. And here is the seventh, and this time it's treated like a suspension, even if it's not on a strong beat. Doesn't matter what the metrical position is. Here's a third option, in which the seventh is treated a bit like an upper neighbor note. E up to F and down again. The chords are tonic, dominant seventh, first inversion, tonic. So the ideal scenario is for the seventh of the chord to be either prepared like a suspension or approached by step. And then in each case, it will resolve down. And if it's an offbeat extra note, you might skip up to it. To help you understand seventh chords, let's look at a specific, very important progression, which you can find at the beginning of Bach's first prelude from the Well-Tempered Clavier, and thousands of other Baroque pieces, including many Bach chorales. The first chord is a tonic chord. The second chord is a supertonic seventh chord in third inversion. So the root is the note D, and C down here is the seventh. The seventh is prepared like a suspension in this chord, and then it must resolve to the leading note, which is why you've got a dominant chord here. But it isn't just a dominant chord, it's a dominant seventh chord with an F, which is the seventh of the dominant seventh chord, and that seventh is prepared. And then it resolves down to a mediant note, which is why you've got another tonic chord. And you could throw in various ingenious surprises here, but this is a very normal progression that you get all the time in chorales and different rhythms too. For example, sometimes these are in quavers. One noticeable thing is that this little chunk of music is entirely conjunct. There are no skips at all. There's also oblique motion here, oblique motion here, and oblique and contrary motion here. So it's contrapuntally optimal. Seventh chords are, I would say, your friends. You don't have to worry about parallel octaves. And they also create this psychological effect of anticipation. The last seventh chord we'll look at is the diminished seventh, which is even more dissonant than the dominant and half diminished chords. This chord occurs diatonically in the minor key on the raised leading note. It can also be used in major keys as well, but you would have to make the seventh flat, or at least chromatically altered downwards. And since the root is normally the leading note, this chord tends to progress to the tonic chord. Leading note chord, diminished seventh, normally proceeds to the tonic chord, because the leading note normally resolves to the tonic. In fact, this chord is normally considered a variant or a substitute for the dominant seventh chord, or possibly the dominant minor ninth, which is what you would get if you added a dominant note underneath. As the name implies, the seventh is a diminished seventh from the root up. From B natural, for example, to A flat is a diminished seventh. But the quirk of this chord is that it also includes two tritones, or two diminished fifths, or augmented fourths, depending on the voicing. One from the root to the fifth, and one from the third to the seventh. And it's a really effective chord, but you have to learn how it resolves, which is as follows. The root, as I said, resolves up to the tonic note, not because it's dissonant, but because it's the leading note of the scale. The fifth and the seventh both resolve down by step, because they're both diminished in relation to the root. If they're below the root, they'll be augmented, but they'll still resolve down. And the third can resolve either direction. Normally up, because that way you resolve the top diminished fifth inwards. But the important thing is that if it's a leading note chord, the leading note resolves up and the fifth and seventh resolve down. This is why a third inversion, diminished seventh, is not often used, because if you resolved it properly, you would get a dissonant second inversion tonic chord, which would then also have to resolve. Here the leading note would resolve up, the A flat and F would both resolve down, and the third could resolve up or down. Likewise here, the third is at the top, so it could resolve up. Yet again, there's a special idiom in which you can use unequal fifths as before. Here are the unequal fifths. Instead of resolving down, the F, which is the fifth, can go up if it's in parallel tenths with the bass line. Now we've looked at how the interval structure of different chords influences what can happen next, including dissonant chords and dissonant notes in a chord, especially sevenths. But before we go on, let's have another look at suspensions. To remind you, here is a two-part suspension formula, the 7/6 suspension. This note, the note C, is the preparation. Then it becomes the suspension on this beat, and then it resolves here. Resolves down by step. And this note down here, if you remember, is sometimes called the agent, which has nothing to do with the matrix. It just means that it's the note that moves in such a way that this note becomes dissonant. And the note before the agent can be any note that's consonant under a C, for example, an A. Now, what makes suspensions in chorales potentially confusing is that you will have two extra notes at the same time as the suspension, as well as the agent. So which one is the agent, and what do you have to remember? Let's first take suspensions that are not in the bass. They're either there in the tune already, or you put them in the alto or tenor voice. In this case, you regard the bass note as the official agent note against which the suspension moves. So you remember we had a 4/3 suspension, a 7/6 suspension, and now there's also a 9/8 suspension. Let's look at 4/3 suspension. For example, let's say we're in C major and the alto does a suspension above the bass. The alto has the notes F, E above a C. That's a 4/3 suspension. C up to F is a fourth, C up to E is a third. This third normally implies a root position chord, with the chordal third as the resolution of the suspension. And so the important thing is not to put another E at the same time with the F, because that will clash and spoil the suspension, like this. So instead, you just make sure to use the other chord notes. For example, we might put a G in the soprano and another root in the tenor. And maybe the previous chord would be an F chord. Excuse my stem. And now it sounds fine, because we didn't introduce the resolution note too early. Preparation, suspension, resolution. Another suspension was 7/6 above the bass note. Let's say that this time the soprano does the suspension and the soprano does this. This would have to already be in the tune. And if the bass note here is an E, then I get a 7/6 suspension, because E up to D is a seventh and E up to C is a sixth. And normally, this will imply a first inversion chord, and the C is the root. Here the resolution is the third, but here the resolution is the root, and the bass note is the third. So again, what I do is to avoid putting another C in between. So I might have a fifth here, and perhaps it might even be a unison, or I might put another fifth down here with a slightly odd spacing. And then the 9/8 is the new suspension that we didn't discuss yet, because 9/8s are frowned on in two-part counterpoint, because if you do a 9/8 in two parts, then there's no third and it sounds a bit bare. But now the third's going to be in one of the other parts. So let's this time put the suspension in the tenor. And let's do D to a C. And this is 9/8. This time we have anticipated the resolution note, but it's deliberate because it's a 9/8 suspension and the agent is an octave below the resolution in the bass. And this will sound fine, provided we don't do this on the leading note, because then we'd have a doubled leading note. But I don't want another tonic note, so the other two parts will be third and fifth, either way up, for example, like so. So perhaps this might happen, depending on the tune. That would give me a dominant seventh chord, first inversion. In which case this seventh would probably be prepared in the previous chord, whatever that was. And if you want to get fancy, you can look into double suspensions, which will resolve down in parallel. For example, you could have a 9/8 and a 4/3 at the same time, or a 9/8 and a 7/6 sometimes. And they will resolve down also in parallel thirds or sixths. For example, here's a dominant seventh chord in first inversion again, like here. But instead of just doing a 9/8 suspension in the tenor, I could do a 4/3 suspension as well in the alto. Two suspensions, and they're in thirds. They move in parallel thirds. And in each case, if we were to remove the suspension, we would just get a chord, a normal chord. If we were to remove the note F, we'd have a C major chord with two roots. If we were to remove the D and shift the C along here, then we'd have a C major chord with two fifths, and so on. We'd have the same chord as here. And here, we would also have a tonic chord. In fact, this double suspension is this one plus this one. So that's the situation for suspensions in the tune, alto or tenor. But sometimes Bach uses a suspension in the bass. And it'll be a 2/3 suspension, which is this one. And this time the agent note, the one that makes the suspension dissonant, will be in one of the upper parts, or possibly more than one. The soprano, alto, or tenor will do the note a second above, or a ninth above. And the resolution note could be the root of a root position chord, but most often it'll be the third of a first inversion chord. Perhaps most often the leading note, in which case this will be a dominant chord. So this will appear in the bass. Here's the suspension. Here's the resolution. And this is the non-chord note. And the chord is going to be a dominant chord first inversion, which is a G major chord, if I'm in C major. And so all I have to do is to include at least one supertonic note, which is this agent, and a G for the root of the chord, and definitely not another leading note. And if this is the tonic chord, then perhaps this will happen, depending on the given tune. But you might have a passing note, and then this would happen. And you'd expect the leading note to in turn go back up. Maybe we'll do another suspension up here, like so. Now let's do a general summary of principles of voice leading, after which we can whiz through the various progressions. First of all, no parallel unisons, fifths or octaves. Perfect fifths, that is. Second, similar motion to a unison fifth or octave sometimes happens. They're called exposed or hidden or direct unisons, fifths, octaves. And it's acceptable if it doesn't cause any other problems. And if it's between the outer parts, then the soprano should move by step. For example, this is okay because the soprano moves by step. This sometimes happens, and the tenor moves by step, and the bass leaps, consonant leap. This might happen. It's an exposed fifth between the soprano and the tenor. And you have to watch out for passing notes in such circumstances. Number 3, don't double the leading note. Number 4, resolve sevenths of seventh chords down by step, except in that special idiom we went through, and don't double them. So for example, dominant seventh chord, first inversion, root, third, fifth, seventh, resolves down by step, tonic chord. Never do this, never have two sevenths. Otherwise, try to use what's called the rule of the shortest way, which just means having parts sustain notes or move by step whenever it's correct to do so. For example, the tune goes like this, and you decide you can do a bass line like so, with a suspension, and then you try to make the inner parts, if possible, conjunct. And you can use passing notes to make the counterpoint even more conjunct. Doubling. Normally when you use a second inversion chord, you double the bass. Like this, for example. There's a second inversion chord resolving to a root position chord. And the reason to double the bass note is that it's the genuine root once you resolve these two notes. In particular, the tonic note here is a dissonant note. So you don't want to double that, because it's a dissonant note. And if you do a passing 6/4 chord, then you tend to also double the bass note, because another part, normally an inner part, will do the opposite game. It will do the reverse of this. This is an F chord. This is a C chord in second inversion, passing 6/4 chord. And this is a D minor 7 chord. So this is chord 4. This is chord 2, also known as 2-7-B. And therefore this C must resolve next. But you double the bass note, and the tenor in this case goes F, G, A, and the bass goes A, G, F. And that means that the tenor and bass swap notes, because the bass goes from A to F, and the tenor goes from F to A, and this G is a passing note, and this G is also a passing note. So in both cases, you typically double the bass note when you have a 6/4 chord. And in the most important tonic and dominant chords, such as the first chord or the cadential chords, you normally double the root. So a chorale might start like this. And it might end like this, with two roots. And the dominant chord would normally also include two roots. That's at the beginning and end, the most important structural chords of all. But in between, doubling is quite flexible, provided you never double the leading note, or the seventh of a seventh chord. And normally the best choice of which note to double is whatever gives you the most conjunct voice leading, and the least leapy, random sounding counterpoint. And it's definitely untrue that you may never double the third. Sometimes it's necessary to double the third. For example, in an interrupted cadence, where the soprano goes leading note tonic, or even not in a cadence but with these chords, you can't double the root of this chord. You're going to end up with parallels or with very ungainly exposed octaves. So what happens is that the inner parts descend. They go in contrary motion, probably with a passing note. This means that you double the third of chord 6. And in chord 2, you very often double the third. And in chord 7, you most often or very often double the third. And never the root, because the root is the leading note. Sometimes you even double the third of chord 1 in the outer parts. Here's a C major chord, E at the bottom, E at the top. And if you play it on its own, it has a slightly striking, unusual sonority. But it sounds okay if the outer parts are treated in contrary motion. For example, like this. Notice that this is entirely conjunct. But the bass goes up and the soprano goes down. Regarding the spacing of chords, you should have no more than an octave between the soprano and the alto, and no more than an octave from the alto down to the tenor. Close position spacing is like this, with the top 3 parts as close together as possible, and it's okay to have a bigger interval at the bottom. And normally, to avoid parallels, you have to alternate between close position and open position like this, in which the intervals between soprano and alto and tenor are a bit bigger, but still usually not greater than an octave. And most often the biggest space is at the bottom, but not always. For example, not in this pattern. So that's just a rule of thumb, really. And it's still the case here that the top 3 parts are quite close together. Very important. You're not obliged to just have chords in crotchets the whole time. You can use consonant skips in certain voices in order to improve the progression into the next chord. For example, sometimes Bach ends up with a low tenor voice, with a low tenor note, and then leaps up so that it's higher again, and then it will change direction after that leap. So you might get something like this. And when you're in the minor key, try to avoid the augmented second from, in this case, A flat to B natural. So this would determine your voice leading in some cases, because your options here are to go from an A flat down and not up by step, or if you want to go up, then you make the A natural. For example, this might happen. This is chord 4, 5, and this is chord 1, major 4, 7. And now we're ready to look at the main progressions in terms of root to root.